Shalom, welcome to Rob on the Rock. Here we are close to the holiday of Purim, or Lots, where traditionally the book of Esther is read. So let's take a look at the Megillah, or the scroll of Esther, and some trivia concerning this wonderful little book. So here we're looking at a 15th century Megillah. Megillah. Mem, Gimel, Lamed, Hey, Megillah. And that's the word for scroll. And a Megillah, though, is not a term used in the book of Esther itself. Megillah we see in the book of Jeremiah, in Ezekiel, and some other places, but we do not see the word Megillah actually in the book of Esther itself. However, when we talk about the Megillah, it is talking about, by shorthand, the book of Esther. And the main place where that tradition is solidified is from around the year 200, the rabbinic law called the Mishnah of Yehuda HaNasi, that is the halakhic code of Judah the Prince. There is what's called Masechet Megillah, or the tractate on the Megillah of Esther, about the reading of Esther. And there's some other traditions in that Masechet. But specifically, it talks about the religious duty, the obligation that Jews have to hear recited the book of Esther. It can't be from heart. It can't be recited from heart. It can't be in an Aramaic translation, nor any other translation. Any of those situations, the person's obligation to hear the Megillah would not be fulfilled. And this is a religious obligation before God. It's imagined to be that strong, that the celebration of Purim, marked by the hearing of the story of Esther, is anchored in the earliest strata of rabbinic law, that is the Mishnah. Now, we don't hear of Esther specifically in the apostolic writings. However, we do know that in the first century world, the Hebrew book of Esther had already been translated into Greek. In addition to just a translation, many sections were added. Up to 6 substantial additions were made, exemplifying the character of Esther, of Mordecai having a dream and its interpretation. Not only that, the book of Esther itself doesn't have the name of God or even the word Elohim in it. It does in the Greek translation, in these expansions, prayer and God are mentioned. So we know that Esther was received in the Hellenistic Jewish, or the Jewish Greek communities, as a wonderful traditional Jewish heritage. And we do know that by the end of the first century, we do have one recording. It's in the Epistle of Clement, of First Clement, which of course is not canonical, but it's a letter written by a leader in the Church of Rome, or the Ecclesia of Rome at the time, at the end of the first century, to the Ecclesia in Corinth. And he is talking about Esther, and he talks about how Esther exposed herself to danger, and that she had perfect faith, that Esther was a woman of perfect faith, and that her exposing herself to danger was so that she might deliver the 12 tribes of Israel who were about to be destroyed. So by the end of the first century, we have a believer in Yeshua in Rome writing about Esther and how she gave herself in order to deliver the 12 tribes of Israel. And that says, this is in 1 Clement 55, says, "For through her fasting and her humility, or humiliation, she entreated the all-seeing Lord, or Master, the God of the ages. And he, seeing the humility of her soul, rescued the people for whose sake she had faced the danger." So Esther is upheld here by a first century believer in Yeshua as a woman of perfect faith, of fasting and humility, and entreating the God of Israel, and being exposed to danger, all at the same time. Now, of course, at this time, the the church was in persecution. And so Esther, at the end of the first century, probably was one example of the traditional stories of Israel to help build up and edify those who were suffering persecution as an exemplar of perfect faith, particularly a woman. Now, this contrasts with the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, we do not have any fragment of Esther. There is a scholar who argues that, but to me, it's completely unconvincing. There's no evidence, no fragments in any substance that say this is Esther. Additionally, we have the calendars that are attested at Qumran are a 364-day calendar, and there is no mention of Purim, at all. So no fragments of Esther, no mention of Purim. And so the scholars that I trust with respect to the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, Marty Abegg Jr. or the late Peter Flint, they state, this was an ideologically driven exclusion. So Esther was rejected by the Yachad community. And there could be reasons why that we could suppose. For example, it's a story of a Jewish girl who marries a Gentile, right? That in of itself could be seen as scandalous. Additionally, as we know in the Hebrew, the name of God is not mentioned. But there's also the polemic against the Pharisees. If we accept that the Pharisees embraced the story of Esther and the celebration of Purim, which I think we have every reason to accept, then this was one other place of polemic where the Yachad, or the Essenes, if that's indeed who inhabited the Qumran community and all its cells throughout the land, which I think is the most compelling explanation of who was at Qumran. This is another point where they can differentiate themselves from groups like the Pharisees that, of course, had a popular grasp. Now, with that in mind, we can look also and see how Paul of Tarsus considered himself a Benjaminite, right? He said he was from the tribe of Benjamin, which means he would have tribal affiliation with the story specifically of Esther, because Mordecai, too, is from the tribe of Benjamin. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to show the picture that you see here. This scroll is a 15th century Sephardic Megillah, or scroll of Esther, that was recently donated to the National Library of Israel, and they published these pictures. I'm going to scroll up here, and you'll be able to see the first 3 columns of this Megillah of Esther. And you can see it's very fragile. It's a beautiful photograph. Sadly, it's not super high res, but I can show you here that while the upper right corner is of course 1:1, verse 1:1, what we see down here is the beginning of chapter 2, verse 5, where it says that there was a man who was a Jew. It says, Ish Yehudi Haya. And that begins right here. Ish Yehudi Haya. That means there was a man, a Yehudi. Now, Yehud is the name of the Persian province of the Persian kingdom. Yehud was demarcated as one of the provinces. And so people from that province were called Yehudim. So when you read the story of Esther, you hear about the Jews. It's talking about the Yehudim. These are those who are living in Persia, but they have kept their own cultural identity, even though they are far away from their homeland. So, for example, if there was a mass group of people from Italy who were living in South America, they would be called the Italians, for example. It doesn't mean all Italians everywhere. It's talking about the Italians in that particular location. But they're called Italians because they're from Italy. That's what's happening here. They're called Yehudim because they're from Yehud. And that's what it says here. It says Ish Yehudi Haya, and it says Ushamo Mordecai. Right here. Ushamo Mordecai ben Yair. And his name was Mordecai ben Yair. And that's 2 verse 5. So we don't see anything further from this released photograph. This is the beginning of the unrolling of the Megillah. But we can see all of chapter 1 here into the first verses of chapter 2. And it's pretty cool to see a 15th century Sephardic Megillah. Well, I hope this was informative for you. And if you have any questions, you can post them in the comments. And hopefully I can get to those and we can have an interaction about this trivia about Megillah, about the scroll of Esther. Shalom.